Okay friends, it's time to get started on our job. One of the first things you want to do is safely raise and support the front of the vehicle with the suspension hanging so the wheel's off the ground. After that, we're going to move along to removing our center cover. If you were to feel along it, you're going to find an area that you can carefully get in between with a small pry bar. Once you have that cover off of there, continue on to removing all 5 of your 19mm lug nuts and then the wheel. Alright, so now that we have the wheel off, we have a nice clear view of our outer tie rod end, our inner tie rod end, and our bellows boot. We're going to come right here to the center, in between the outer and the inner. You're going to find a jam nut. For this, I just use some long pliers, grab onto it, and I'm going to turn it clockwise to try to break it free. There we are. Let's move underneath that outer tie rod end. We're going to be looking for a locking cotter pin. Go ahead and remove that cotter pin, and then remove the nut. We'll use a 21mm to remove this. Now it's going to be time to separate the outer tie rod end stud, which comes down through this area, from the knuckle. To do this, you can either use a pickle fork, which could potentially damage this boot, or you can just give this a couple loving bonks along the knuckle area here. Don't damage the knuckle though. Let's continue with our hammer. Here we go. Alright, so the hard part's over. At this point, we're just going to continue by removing the outer tie rod end from the inner. To do that, you want to hold on to the inner so it cannot spin. We're going to turn the outer tie rod end counterclockwise until it fully unscrews from the inner. While you're doing this, count the amount of turns it takes to remove it. You want to make sure that when you go to install the outer tie rod end, it goes on the same amount of threads. 1, 2, and so on. Alright, go ahead and write that number down. Now it's going to be time to fully remove this jam nut from the inner tie rod end. Typically you can hold on to the inner tie rod end and then you're just going to use a 22mm to go ahead and remove this. Now that we have the jam nut off of there, we're going to continue on to getting ready to remove the bellows boot. For the bellows boot, you're going to find that you have an outer clamp, which is generally easy enough to get to using some long nose pliers. You just want to go ahead and squeeze on the 3 ears. We'll squeeze them together and slide this down and off. Now once we have the outer clamp off, we're going to continue to the inner clamp. If you were to follow the bellows boot into where it connects onto the power steering rack, you're going to find that you have a metallic tab. This clamp is a single time use. We're just going to go ahead and put something on there and break it off. We'll just use a hammer and a pry bar and get right up against that metallic clamp there and give it a loving bonk. Once that's broken free, continue on by grabbing onto the bellows boot. We're going to give it a little twist to try to break it free from the power steering rack. As we start breaking it free, we're also going to be pulling it away from the vehicle. If you were to look along where the power steering rack comes through this area, you're going to find that you have a breather tube that makes its way from one side of the power steering rack all the way over to the other. It's extremely important to pay attention to that tube, make sure it's still secured on the other side of the vehicle, and now with that said, we can get ready to install our brand new bellows boot. Let's get this on the vehicle. Right here is where the groove is. Now at this point, I'm going to continue by putting the wheels in the straight position. After that, we can go ahead and set the boot up against the rack and against the breather tube. And now we're going to continue with a wire tie. We're going to use this right along the boot. When you put it on there, just leave it nice and loose. We just essentially want to have it so it's semi in position, so once we get it down inside here, you can easily grab it with some long nose pliers. Now as I slide this into position, I want to be paying attention to my little breather tube that's in there. I want to make sure that that lines up as well. All right, so at this point I have my vent tube in position. I've got everything lined up. I'm going to continue on by using my long pliers and tightening up this clamp. Trim off the excess. Use one of these wire ties for an outer clamp as well. Copper never sees. Now it's time for our jam nut. Time to install the outer tie rod end. We'll take this and we're going to screw it on. As we're turning this on, we want to count the amount of threads going on and make sure it matches the same amount of threads as when you removed it. Now we can line this up with our knuckle, slide it into position. Let's put on that lower nut. Bottom this out. Torque this nut to 66 foot-pounds. The next thing you want to do is pay attention to the stud of the tie rod. You're going to find that it has a hole in it. Looking at the nut, you can see it has a whole bunch of little slots on it. You want to make sure that one of the slots lines up with the corresponding hole of the stud. If for some reason it's not perfectly lined up, continue tightening the nut until the very next slot does. Make sure you peen it over so there's no way this nut can loosen up on its own. Now it's time to bottom out the jam nut. We're going to make sure that this is nice and tight. To do that, you want to hold the outer tie rod end with a 19mm wrench right along the slotted area here. After that, we'll continue by tightening the jam nut with our 21mm wrench. Just make sure those are nice and tight. Now you want to pay attention to the outer tie rod end and make sure it's parallel to the ground. If it looks like it's tilted from one side or the other, you could potentially cause some damage to the joint itself. Now let's go ahead and put the wheel back up on here. We'll start on all 5 of our 19mm lug nuts. Bottom them out, get the wheel safely back on the ground, and then torque each of them to 100 foot-pounds. Now that the wheel's back on the ground, let's torque these to 100 foot-pounds. Of course, if you have a center cover, go ahead and put that on now. Looking at the back of it, you're going to find you have one area that protrudes looking like this. That needs to fit into any of your lug nut holes.